Alors, bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. We will begin without much further ado. So, welcome to our guests. Welcome to meeting number 50 of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. So today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we will continue our study on sexual harassment in the federal workplace. This morning, from the Department of Defense, we are welcoming Carol Wennick. Welcome, sir. Commander Tony Crew. Ms. Jacqueline Rigg, good morning. Ms. Susan Harrison, good morning. And Lieutenant Colonel Marc Gendron. I'm sorry, I got the original pronunciation wrong. And finally, from the National Defence and Canadian Forces Ombudsman, Mr. Alain Gauthier. So what we'll do this morning, we'll have 3 10-minute presentations, followed by questions until 10:30. So to begin, Mr. Carol Wennick. Mr. Wennick, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
As the Director General Military Personnel, I'm responsible for, among other things, personnel policies intended to prevent discrimination and achieve equal employment opportunities throughout the Canadian Forces. With me today to assist in answering your questions on sexual harassment and related issues is Commander Tony Crew, the Director of Human Rights and Diversity for the Canadian Forces. Also with us is Lieutenant Colonel Marc Gendron, Director of Law Military Personnel in the Office of the Judge Advocate General. He is available to provide information regarding the legal processes and procedures that might be engaged in dealing with allegations of sexual harassment. In the comments that follow, I will briefly address our policy framework, our definition of harassment, military statistics on sexual harassment, the training and education of military members, and some recent initiatives relevant to this topic. The Canadian Forces and the Department of National Defence have a joint harassment prevention and resolution policy that applies to both military and civilian personnel. The Director of Human Rights and Diversity, who reports to me, is responsible for the harassment prevention and resolution policy as it applies to military members. The Canadian Forces policy on harassment was introduced in the 1980s and updated several times thereafter. The most recent version of the policy, dated December 2000, shifted the emphasis to prevention and early resolution through alternative dispute resolution and brought military and civilian personnel under the same policy. The policy's overall goal is to provide and ensure a respectful workplace by promoting the prevention of harassment and the prompt resolution of harassment complaints. Although I am here this morning to speak specifically about sexual harassment, I think it is helpful to view our policy as part of a spectrum of Canadian Forces policies pertaining to sexual behavior in the workplace. We have, for example, a policy regulating personal relationships and fraternization that is intended to preserve trust and the integrity of command while preventing the exploitation of junior military members and other vulnerable personnel. Additionally, our sexual misconduct policy deals with behaviors that are either sexual in nature or committed with the intent to commit an act or acts that are sexual in nature and which constitute an offense under the criminal code or code of service discipline. These behaviors include offenses such as sexual assault, indecent exposure, voyeurism, and acts involving child pornography. Our policy on harassment and sexual harassment falls somewhere in the middle of this policy continuum. Harassment is defined as, quote, any improper conduct by an individual that is directed at and offensive to another person or persons in the workplace, and that the individual knew or ought reasonably to have known would cause offense or harm. It comprises any objectionable act, comment, or display that demeans, belittles, or causes personal humiliation or embarrassment, and any act of intimidation or threat. It includes harassment within the meaning of the Canadian Human Rights Act, unquote. We have no definition or policy specifically for sexual harassment. Systematic information on sexual harassment in the Canadian Forces is derived in varying degrees from 4 data sources: our tracking system for internally filed harassment complaints, our alternative dispute resolution database, statistics on human rights complaints externally filed with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and periodic surveys of military members. The harassment complaint tracking system is intended to capture all harassment complaints in both the Canadian Forces and the Department. From 2002 to October 2012, there were 513 complaints by military members recorded in the harassment complaint tracking system. Of these, 31, or 6%, were sexual harassment complaints. Of these 31 sexual harassment complaints in this 10-year period, 11 were determined to be founded or partially founded. This is an incidence rate of about 1 a year in the military population of roughly 100,000 personnel. The remaining 20 complaints are either still open, were unfounded, were withdrawn, or were referred to the military police. When sexual assault is suspected during an investigation, these cases are automatically referred to the military police in accordance with the sexual misconduct policy I referenced earlier. Of the founded complaints, 10 were by female members and 1 was by a male who filed a complaint against a male respondent. For the founded sexual harassment complaints, the process to complete the investigation and resolution of the complaint took 90 days on average. The policy requires responsible officers to finalize a complaint within 180 days. In accordance with the current policy, there are, of course, consequences for respondents when complaints are determined to be founded. The most frequent administrative measure was to send the respondent on harassment awareness training, followed by recorded warning as the next most common action taken. In some cases, an apology was required, and in a few cases, the offending individual was suspended from duty. In one case, a fine was given, and in 2 cases, the individual was sent on communications and leadership training. Statistics on harassment are also kept by the Director General Alternative Dispute Resolution. It should be noted, however, that while statistics are available on cases involving harassment, their database does not differentiate among categories, for example, sexual harassment. According to past issues of their annual report, they determined that the number of combined military and civilian harassment cases from 2002 to 2010 to have ranged from a low of 153 to a high of 382. Statistics drawn from the Human Rights Commission complaints database for the period 2002 to 2012 indicate that there were 196 complaints lodged against the forces, sexual harassment accounting for 13, or 6.6% of all complaints. These latter involve 2 prohibited grounds of discrimination, namely sex and sexual orientation. Of the 13 sexual harassment complaints, 8 were resolved by mediation, 2 complaints were dismissed, 1 was withdrawn as a result of the grievance process, and 2 have not yet been finalized. In 1992 and again in 1998, a Canadian Forces survey on harassment was conducted in which participants were asked if they had experienced harassment within the previous 12 months. In 1992, 26% of women and 2% of men believed they had been subjected to sexual harassment. In the 1998 survey, results showed a decline in the reported rate for sexual harassment, which was 14% for women. The results of a 2012 harassment survey of regular force members are currently being finalized and will be available in the coming months. Subsequent survey research will focus on members of the reserve force and recruits and is scheduled to be conducted in 2013. All Canadian Forces members receive elements of harassment prevention and resolution training at various levels of their professional development throughout their careers. Upon entry into the forces, both non-commissioned members and officers receive training on personal conduct policies, where the intended outcome is adherence to the professional norms expected of military members. As part of this module, military members are taught that harassment in any form is consistent with defense ethics and constitutes unacceptable conduct and will not be tolerated. As noted in the policy, application and enforcement of the harassment prevention and resolution policy is the responsibility of leaders and commanders designated as responsible officers. Consequently, all new commanding officers are required to certify that they have read and understood the Chief of Defense Staff's guidance to commanding officers, which, among other things, highlights their duties for harassment prevention and resolution, including their role as responsible officers for members under their command. As part of our continuing effort to remind people of our policy on harassment, we released new harassment prevention posters this year and distributed them to all units in the Canadian Forces for display in common work areas. The messages are simple and straightforward, and the posters allow for the inclusion of local contact information. By way of conclusion, the hard data portray a reassuring picture of sexual harassment in the Canadian Forces, in that the incidence of formal complaints, both internally and externally, is relatively low. Alternative dispute resolution statistics suggest a higher rate of harassment incidents, but if most complaints are being resolved through the options of self-help, supervisor intervention, or mediation, rather than through the more adversarial forms of formal investigations, that is also encouraging. The decline over time in self-report survey responses of sexual harassment is also good news. But I hasten to add that 2 data points do not constitute a trend. We look forward with interest, therefore, to the next round of survey results. This concludes my opening statement. Thank you for your attention. My colleague will now proceed with her opening statement.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Winnick. And now we'll move on to Ms. Rigg. Ms. Rigg, you have 10 minutes.
With you today. My name is Jacqueline Rigg. I am the Director General of the Civilian Human Resource Management Operations in the Department of National Defense. I oversee the operations of 6 civilian human resources centers across Canada, and I work in partnership with civilian and military managers in the area of strategic and operational human resource management. With me today is Susan Harrison, Director of Civilian Labor Relations. She's the director responsible for the civilian harassment policy. To put my remarks today in context, I offer the following description of the D&D civilian workforce. The Department of National Defense civilian workforce over the past 10 years has ranged between 20,000 employees and 29,000 employees. The D&D workforce is unionized, being represented by 10 bargaining agents covered by 18 collective agreements. 40% of the civilian workforce are females and are employed in all of the occupational groups ranging from executives to blue-collar trades. Approximately 70% of the entire workforce are managed by members of the Canadian Forces. Department of National Defense is located in all regions of the country, including the North. National Defense is committed to providing a respectful workplace by promoting prevention coupled with prompt resolution of harassment. We believe that all civilians have the right to fairness, respect, and dignity, and to work in a workplace free of harassment. Our strong stance on harassment, including sexual harassment, is evidenced by our standalone policy on harassment and the associated tools to support the program. The Department of National Defense has had a policy in place since 1982. In 2000, the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Forces harmonized their separate policies and introduced the D&D and CF Harassment Prevention and Resolution Policy in advance of the similar Treasury Board of Canada policy. The context of the policy is mutual trust, support, and respect for the dignity and rights of every person are essential characteristics of the work environment. The policy statement itself says, quote, "The Canadian Forces and Department of National Defense are committed to providing a respectful workplace by promoting prevention and prompt resolution of harassment. All Canadian Forces members and Department of National Defense employees have the right to be treated fairly, respectfully, and with dignity in a workplace free of harassment, and they have the responsibility to treat others in the same manner. Harassment in any form constitutes unacceptable conduct and will not be tolerated. No Canadian Forces member or Department of National Defense employee shall subject any person in the workplace to harassment. Any members or employees who subject another person to harassment is liable to disciplinary and administrative action." End quote. Our policy conforms to the requirements of the Treasury Board of Canada policy issued in 2001 and is aligned to the new 2012 policy on harassment prevention and resolution recently released in October. All these policies require the establishment of a complaint procedure, methods of resolving complaints, remedial corrective and restorative measures. D&D is fully compliant. That said, we are in the process of working with the Canadian Forces to revise and update our harmonized policy and all the associated tools. To further support the prevention of harassment in the workplace, accompanying the policy are comprehensive guidelines on prevention, roles and responsibilities, complaint handling, alternate dispute resolution, and workplace restoration. Other tools include guidance for managers' delegated responsibility under the policy and a handbook for all employees which provides a description of the entire policy and program. Additionally, all employees are required to take one of the Department of National Defence courses: Harassment Awareness and Prevention for Employees and Harassment and Awareness Prevention for Supervisors. There's also a similar course delivered through the Canada School of Public Service, or they may take one through the Joint Learning Program of the Treasury Board Secretariat and the Public Service Alliance Canada. While our policy and training are applicable to all Department of National Defence civilian employees, it is important to note that the prohibition of sexual harassment is reinforced by its inclusion in the majority of the collective agreements covering our employees. Grievances under these provisions can be referred to the Public Service Labour Relations Board, and this board is empowered to issue awards under the Canadian Human Rights Act. There are several forms of recourse available to employees who feel that they have been harassed. Employees can submit a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission under the Canadian Human Rights Act. They can submit a complaint to the delegated manager under the policy framework that we have established, and they can also file a grievance under their collective agreement. It goes without saying that sexual harassment complaints are covered by these mechanisms. From a statistical perspective, I offer the following. For Canadian human rights complaints, we have information from 2007 to date. In total, there were 3 sexual harassment complaints, only one of which is still open. The other 2 were settled. For harassment complaints under our policies, we have information from 2000 to date. There were 14 sexual harassment complaints, and 9 were founded during that period. In total, there were 316 harassment complaints filed for various reasons in that same period. For labor relations grievances, our statistical information covers the period from 2008 to date. During that time frame, there were 4 sexual harassment grievances filed. 2 were partially founded, 1 was dismissed, and 1 remains open. We acknowledge that all of these statistics have been generated by different tracking systems and do not permit any further in-depth analysis. The current Government of Canada Human Resources Management Systems has its limitations, but an upgraded version will be coming in 2013 and will enable better capture and analysis of data. As part of our Human Resources Modernization Program, we, of course, are working in collaboration with the Program Center, which comprises of representatives from central agencies and several government departments, including the Department of National Defence. In closing, I would like to share with you some facts about women in the Department of National Defence. Of particular note is that women are overrepresented in the management group made up primarily of executives. We consider this to be especially positive given the nature of our organization and the challenges women face in achieving such levels in the private sector. Department of National Defence has also has a large blue-collar workforce performing functions related to industrial trades and equipment operation. In this blue-collar sector, women are well represented. Similarly, women are well represented in the senior administrative and the scientific professional sectors. Where we are short on the employment of women is in the technical groups, which are related to ammunition workers, engineering support, and electronic technologists. Closing this long-standing gap is one of the priorities of our Employment Equity Plan, which is about to be published. We are currently in the process of renewing the D&D CF Harmonized Harassment Policy and will continue to have this issue at the forefront of how we manage our employees. Worthy of note is that the Public Service Employment Survey indicates that 73% of the D&D civilian population believes that the Department of National Defense works, quote, hard to create a workplace that prevents harassment, end quote. D&D considers harassment in any form to be a serious matter. We have multiple mechanisms to support employees, managers, and the organization with respect to harassment issues. Though we have confidence in our current policies, programs, and initiatives that have led to the relatively low incidence of sexual harassment, we are still very cognizant that even one incident is too many. This concludes my opening remarks.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, Madame Rigg.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rigg. And now we will move on to Mr. Gauthier. Mr. Gauthier, you have 10 minutes. Madam Chair, I would like to begin by thanking the committee for inviting us, or the Office of the Ombudsman, to testify today as part of its study of sexual harassment in the federal workplace. The Ombudsman, Mr. Pierre Daigle, has asked me, in my capacity as Acting Director General of Operations, to provide you with an overview of our mandate policies and practices with respect to the handling of sexual harassment complaints brought to our office.
1998 to ensure the fair treatment of concern raised by current and former member of the Canadian Forces, both regular forces and reservists, by current and former employee of the Department of National Defense, by family member of service personnel and civilian employee, and by Canadian applying to become a member of the Canadian Forces. The Ombudsman has the mandate to investigate and make recommendations to improve the overall well-being and quality of life of the member of the defense community. While our investigator attempt to resolve complaint informally and at the lowest level possible, some complaints require thorough investigation leading to a formal report with findings and recommendations that are made public. Last year, we received more than 1,400 new complaints from our constituent. In total, our investigator and intake officer closed 1,471 cases, including new cases, reopened cases, and cases from previous year. Among these, 65 were related to harassment. 3 were specifically related to sexual harassment. The Ombudsman Office also acts as a direct source of information, referral, and education. It is in this capacity that we address sexual harassment complaints. We ourselves do not investigate allegations of sexual harassment. In such case, our office works closely with the individual to advise them of the various avenues of recourse available to them. Where an individual feels they have not been treated fairly by the existing mechanism within the Canadian Forces and or public service, the Ombudsman can launch an investigation to determine if there are indeed issues or concerns related to fairness which needs to be brought forward to the department on the individual's behalf. As a matter of policy, complainants with unresolved or ongoing complaint are requested to maintain contact with the Ombudsman Office so we can follow up on further questions or concerns. En conclusion, bien que les plaintes de
In conclusion, although complaints of sexual harassment make up a very small fraction of the 16,000 complaints we've received since 1998, we are keenly aware that they need to be treated with sensitivity and compassion. So with that in mind, we do everything that we can to ensure individuals obtain the assistance they need and deserve. Madam Chair, I have provided the clerk of the committee with the details of the disposition of harassment cases the Ombudsman Office has handled over the last 6 years. The information is attached at Annex A of my speaking notes. So now I would be pleased to answer any question committee members may have. Thank you very much, and thank you to all our witnesses for their testimony, which was very interesting. So now let's move on to questions, and this is wonderful. We'll have plenty of time for questions. So we'll start with the government. Ms. Tupi, you have 7 minutes.
We've had all at one time, so thank you for being here. I have a question for Madam Rigg. You had mentioned that the current Government of Canada human resource management system had limitations, but an upgraded version would be coming in 2013. When you had mentioned there were some limitations to the existing system, and then you're looking forward to this new system, what are some of the limitations that you would say they have?
The situation is right now when we're collecting our data for this appearance, we have 3 different sources that we go to in order to receive the facts on this. So we're trying to harmonize it. We review actual complaints that come from the Canadian Human Rights Act. We also review all of our labor relations grievances, and we use the harassment complaint tracking system. So we have to investigate 3 different areas, so we're trying to make it a little better so that we have one area of registering the complaints, and it's no chance of overlap.
So if I were to ask you to describe then what this new updated system would be like, would it be just condensing it all, or is there other benefits as well?
I think that the benefits are, first of all, it'll have one area for tracking it, which will make it much easier for eliminating chances of duplication or things showing up in more than one system. Also, it will be able to better align with all of our other tracking systems that are in place for HR information.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it does sound like it'll be better for you. It must be cumbersome to be going to 3 different areas. I have a couple of questions for Monsieur Winnick. I understand that you're collecting the information regarding the reports of sexual harassment through the different types of conflict resolution processes available. And I think I understand that collecting your data in this way means that some of the cases are reported more than once, and that you're trying to develop the integrated management system for the various conflict resolution procedures. Could you describe the role of the integrated management system and any progress that has been made towards its development?
Madam Chair, fortunately, Commander Crew is the co-chair of the working group that's looking at the integration of those conflict resolution systems. So I'll ask him to respond to that question. So he has some in-depth knowledge of that process.
Great,
Tony,
thank you.
Please.
Thank you, ma'am. Similar to the public service reporting, we have exactly the same issues, trying to go to different databases to get the information, and without actually looking at every file, we don't know if it's a duplication or not.
Right.
So about a year ago, the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff stood up a working group to look at integrated conflict management for Canadian Forces personnel. Not solely because of the data tracking, but data tracking was certainly one of the issues that we had leading to the requirement to study it. We're looking to take a system that's fairly complex with multiple mechanisms, which becomes a little bit difficult for the member at the lower end of the scale who's not quite au fait with all the policies to figure out where to turn to. So what the working group did is looked at the current mechanisms, the issues that are created by those current mechanisms, and we're actually utilizing the business process redesign methodology to map out all of those processes, and then to design a potential integrated process that would combine, at the moment, looking at harassment, grievances, and alternate dispute resolution, and merging those 3 processes into one process. Hopefully to give the member one single point of entry where they would be able to go in and talk to one person, and that person would steer them through the most appropriate mechanism, of course starting with alternate dispute resolution as the preferred option.
Thank you. It sounds confusing having 3 different ones, like for both of you. You know, think it would be confusing for the one that's trying to address their own concern because they wouldn't know where to go and would maybe even possibly give up. Do you have an anticipated date on this system?
We are briefing Armed Forces Council next month in the hopes to get the approval to stand up a small project team of full-time resources, because at the moment the process managers involved we're sort of working this as one of many issues we're dealing with. If we can stand up this small project team, we hope to be able to have something in place, including information management portion, in about 2 years' time.
About 2 years? Okay. Madam Rigg, I don't think I asked you, when do you anticipate yours might be completed?
I'm going to refer that to Susan Harris. I believe it's...
You're referring to the human resource management system?
Your new system.
We're starting to work on it in 2013, and we expect the introduction to be concluded within that fiscal year.
Okay.
That doesn't mean necessarily that it might not be delayed for various resource reasons.
Okay, thank you. Back to Monsieur Winnick. When a formal complaint's about to be filed, are the efforts made to encourage alternative dispute resolution methods prior to proceeding with a formal complaint? Do you maintain statistics related to individuals who sought one resolution over the other?
Again, because that's a process issue that Tony's
Sure.
more familiar with, I'll
okay.
ask him to respond to that one. Sorry, I'm not trying to duck this.
No, the preferred method for any complainant is to approach their supervisor, and at that point, hopefully engage in informal resolution. The formal process is always available, and we certainly don't try to steer them away from it. If a member does not feel comfortable approaching their supervisor for whatever reason, we have workplace relations advisors in some units. We have harassment advisors. They can approach the Dispute Resolution Center and discuss the issue with somebody, and then at the Dispute Resolution Center, they'll always try to turn it back and make sure they engage their unit personnel in the chain of command. But again, depending on the sensitivity and the confidentiality, at some point it will have to be rendered onto paper so that we know exactly what the details, who's involved, what are the facts of the incident, etc. But the hope is they'll go to the supervisor and try informal, early, local, and informal is the way we hope to resolve them.
Okay.
Je vais devoir vous arrêter ici. Votre temps est écoulé.
Sorry, I'll have to stop you here. So thank you very much. We'll now move on to Ms. Ashton for 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Who's joining us today and for your presentations. It's quite clear that both the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Forces have done a fair bit of work in terms of making sure that there's awareness, prevention, mechanisms to deal with harassment or sexual harassment when it takes place. I'm wondering if the RCMP or anyone from the RCMP has been in touch with either the Ombudsman's office or the civilian side or with any of you or your offices in terms of learning from some of the work that you've done.
I'm not aware of any contact with us. So, Tony, you had any?
We've just recently stood up a foresight study on diversity within the CF, but we expanded that to diversity within the security community and invited reps from Communication Security Establishment, RCMP, Border Services, and other related security agencies. And we had several RCMP reps, and while we didn't discuss specifically harassment, we have been asked to sit down and meet with them to discuss more on our employment equity and diversity policy issues, and of which harassment is one that we manage. So I'm sure it'll come up as we get into those discussions.
What's the timeline for that?
There's nothing, because we're in the midst of the diversity foresight study at the moment, that those discussions will probably occur after the foresight study completes, which should be later this month, early December. So probably early in the new year we'll get to discussing the other related issues.
Okay. And
on the civilian side, I'm not aware of any such consultations underway.
Mm-hmm. I realize the Ombudsman Office is a bit different, but wondering...
Nothing from our office either.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because certainly there seems to be some lessons to be learned from the work that you're doing. And one of the issues that we've discussed is the importance of exit surveys, and which is also a gap in the work that the RCMP does. And I mean, no question, there's some differences all across the board, but. In 2009, we're aware that a national report to the Committee for Women in the NATO Forces, it was reported that a comprehensive analysis of exit survey data from 2005 to 2008 was underway as part of monitoring the rate of attrition for female members of the Canadian Forces. The report indicates that the analysis would be used to determine the factors, quote, which prompt female members to leave the CF, unquote, and would be used to make recommendations of corrective measures. I'm wondering if you can tell the committee whether this analysis included consideration of sexual harassment as a possible reason for departure from the forces, and if so, to what extent was it an issue?
The exit survey has been in place for a considerable length of time, I think at least 20 years or more. One of the difficulties in acquiring consistent data about particularly voluntary attrition behavior is that completion of the survey is voluntary. And in some cases, individuals just don't want to say why they left. So we're not getting an entirely reliable picture of why people leave. But among the factors, and we looked at attrition behavior in as recently as 2008, 2009, because our attrition rate within the Canadian Forces generally was elevated. We were up over 9%. We're now currently about 6%. And we were concerned about the effect this was having on force expansion and our ability to meet our growth targets. But what the data from a variety of sources tended to show that particularly for women, but not exclusive to them, it was sort of the work-life balance issue, particularly as people got into 10-plus years of service, that got to be a big factor. As you are probably aware, the CF imposes fairly heavy mobility requirements on military members and their families. We move them around every few years. And for serving members with families and who have spouses or partners who are trying to maintain a career themselves, this becomes disruptive for many of them. And at some point, many of them sort of have to face the decision, do I stay or do I go? And so attrition in the later years of service tends to reflect that dynamic. But I don't recall anything that particularly identified sexual harassment or an unwelcoming work environment for women. In fact, as my recollection is that the attrition statistics show that the rates are about the same for men and women.
Mm-hmm. Out of the exit surveys, have you been able to make any recommendations around sexual harassment?
It hasn't it hasn't surfaced as a sufficiently significant issue for us to address it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess my question would probably be directed to Ms. Rigg. Earlier this year, the Department of National Defense had 1,000 civilian jobs cut. We've heard from others, and certainly it's been stated outside that could be argued that job insecurity may cause stress and raise tension in the workplace. Given that situation, which I understand is relatively recent, I'm wondering if you're seeing an increase in incidents of harassment and including sexual harassment.
30 seconds.
We've not seen an increase related to that in terms of our cuts that are being done in our department right now. Basically, these cuts are being done minus names, people, positions. It's just the position, so there's no identification on whether the incumbent is female or male when they're doing the exercises of streamlining our processes and our activities. So we have not seen anything to this point.
Merci.
Thank you very much. So now we'll move to Ms. O'Neill Gordon for 7 minutes.
For
being with us this morning. Certainly your presentation gives us a clearer understanding of just what is going on in your department, with the Department of National Defense, and how you are trying to prevent sexual harassment. And I like your strong stance in the work you do to provide a workplace free of harassment. And I guess we're all working in that direction. Your policy is clear and specific, and I'd say that prevention seems to be one of your key mottos. You have been speaking a bit of about training and harassment prevention and resolution that Canadian Forces members receive through their careers. And in addition, you noted that the harassment prevention and resolution policy often prescribes training when a complaint is determined to be found. I'm wondering if you, with this focus on training, what sort of harassment prevention and resolution training is available to the members of the Canadian Forces, and at what level of their careers?
Let me approach this with a fairly broad perspective, first of all, in the sense that I think over the last 20 years there has been a significant change in the culture within the Canadian Forces that has been reinforced by a number of initiatives, and which all have as a kind of central focus what is appropriate and professional conduct by people in uniform. That goes back to the mid-90s, after we had some very bad stories about how POWs were treated. We had some bad stories about earlier cases of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and led to a process of institutional reform that examined all those issues and tried to identify the gaps in our programs that weren't producing the requisite kind of professional conduct in some of our members. And I emphasize some. So that begins then, I think, with the development of a defense ethics program, which was instituted a little over a dozen years ago, maybe about 15 years ago, which articulates as its first principle respect and dignity for all persons. And in its elaborated statement, emphasizes issues such as fair treatment of others and avoidance of discrimination and harassment. That program is refreshed throughout the organization on an annual basis, and it's been identified by external agencies as a model kind of program for us. So there is the Defense Ethics Program, which applies equally to members of the Canadian Forces and civilian employees of the department. We have reformed, I shouldn't say reformed, but completely revamped our leadership philosophy. Again, that goes back about 8 or 10 years. And one of the central features of our approach to leadership is that, yes, while there is a strong and always be a strong emphasis on getting the mission accomplished, we must pay equal attention to how we accomplish missions. We cannot break the law of war. We cannot violate principles that are central to what we hold dear as a society and as a culture. So through those kinds of programs, through acculturation into what it means to be a military professional, and we documented that as well as part of this enterprise in the development of a manual on what it means to be a military professional called Duty with Honor. Again, those principles of conducting yourself in a way that will not bring discredit to the organization or to you as an individual. So all those programs have this theme that runs through them, and they're delivered at various stages and through various venues and career and leadership courses. As I mentioned, everyone who goes through basic training, and everybody does unless they've done it previously, they get this exposure to the behavioral norms and expectations that apply to them with respect to harassment, sexual harassment. They're exposed to what it means to live by the Charter, the Canadian Human Rights Act, what it means to be a military professional, what's expected of them when they begin their leadership training, which starts very early for military personnel, what it means to exercise values-based leadership. So through all those programs, they get this theme of respect for others and treating people equally and fairly. And there are specific courses as well which deal with harassment. Now, because most members get the basics through which it's embedded in their normal military training, the specialized courses tend to be for harassment advisors, people who provide advice and guidance to responsible officers, and also harassment investigators. Is there anything you'd like to add, Tony?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. We have 5 levels of leadership development training for our non-commissioned members, another 5 levels for our officers, and every one of those levels, any officer or NCM who's promoted into that next leadership level will go through a professional development training course, which will include and sort of re-emphasize those underlying beliefs.
As is always said, your leadership is a key factor in any training or any workplace. So if you have good leadership at the top, you can be pretty well guaranteed that everything will run as smoothly as you would like it to be anyway. So that's a good method, a good way in which to go. I don't think we could cover anything else more important than respect and leadership along the training. So if you realize that, then I think you're pretty well on the right road, and I want to congratulate you for a job well done. That's fine.
Vous avez terminé? Merci.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Ms. Groh. Please take your time getting settled back in.
Get up just at the wrong time. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. And I have to say I'm so pleased to hear such positive comments. But you've been to war in the sense that you've been through it in the 90s. And Senator Dallaire has certainly talked about some of the problems that were clearly evident at that time, and the changes, and holds you up as the example for many other departments and many other areas that you've worked on. So congratulations for the work that you've done. How do you, when we talk about having to have a cultural change, which is part of the concern, is how do you start to see that cultural change? I mean, you've got thousands of people that work for you, and we can bring in all of the wonderful policies that's possible, and you can read Treasury Board and all the things in the Federal Public Service that talk so good about things that are unacceptable and all that. But it doesn't matter what you put there if people are got an attitude of not necessarily what they don't even interpret it as unacceptable behavior. It's just their behavior, and that's just the way it is, I think. So how do you see that cultural change in your organization today versus how it was in the 90s? What would stand out for people to see and those who work for you?
I think the major index of any cultural change is behavioral change. I mean, it's sometimes, I think, or it's often stated that you have to change attitudes first before you see the necessary behavioral change. But that isn't always the case. In fact, through the strong enforcement of the desired behavioral norms, you can change the behavior first, and eventually the attitudes will move as well to be consistent with the behavior that is deemed acceptable and desirable. So we use indices of behavioral change, I think, as our primary index of, or primary measure of cultural change. And we do that largely through personnel surveys. We survey people in the military, some would say almost to death. But it's the only way we can sort of find out in an impartial and a relatively objective way, how people view these particular changes. So surveys on harassment, surveys on the ethics program, surveys on the efficacy of the policy and program are very important, provide very important measures to us about how we are doing. And in that vein, there was a survey sponsored by our Chief of Review Services in 2005, in which members were surveyed about the policy on harassment and the program. And there were some very encouraging results. One that, to the effect, for example, that 90% of CF members indicated that they had received some form of harassment awareness training. They saw the policy as clear and effective. So that these were very strong indicators to us that we were doing the right thing. And that really becomes the motivator for policy or program change, where you have large proportions of a population who are dissatisfied with a policy, program, or its application. That should be really your signal that you have to do something about it. And that is our primary measure of how we are doing and whether or not we're on the right track.
Yeah, how much would you attribute some of the change to the fact that you have a significant amount of women in senior positions?
For the Canadian Forces, actually, that's not the case. Our representation of women in the Canadian Forces is about 15% of the regular and reserve force. Above the rank of lieutenant colonel, it's less than that. It's about 9%, 8%. Starts to get lower as you get into the general ranks. That's largely because of where women choose to work in the Canadian Forces. And I'll just back up a bit and try and paint the picture for you. If you look at how women are employed in Canada generally in industries, and we have this data from Statistics Canada, that the goods-producing sector is heavily dominated by men. You know, this is natural resources, manufacturing, agriculture, those kinds of industries. In the service sector, a couple of industries are dominated by women. These tend to be health, education, a couple of others. And then in a number of the others, it's more or less balanced. Business, for example, relatively equal. And if you look at the military by comparison, for our equivalent to the goods-producing sector is combat occupations. Women are very infrequently represented in those occupations, in most cases 5% or less, whereas they were heavily represented in the service occupations. Now, the key to understanding then what does that mean for promotion and access to senior rank is that the emphasis in the military is fielding combat-capable forces and preparing people for command. So if people from those occupations are predominantly men, you're going to see predominantly men in the senior ranks as a result of that, although an effort is made to ensure that women have access to those occupations and to senior rank as much as possible.
Ms. Reid, would you
Yes, Madam Chair. We never have looked into the correlations, very good observation, the correlation of the leadership, increase in the women leadership in the civilian workforce. But I think that coupled with the other things that we have in place in terms of we have annual ethics days, just the whole culture and knowledge sharing around these topics are very much richer in our organization now. So I think that if you couple them together, it could have a reason as to why culture will move along with the different policies that we're developing.
Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. If everyone agrees, I would suggest we take a 5-minute break. Since exceptionally today we have a large panel and it'll give the opportunity of our guests to grab a coffee. And I will therefore suspend the meeting for about 5 minutes. Thank you. Could everybody please regain their seats? We will resume our deliberations.
Alors, nous voilà de retour.
So we're back. And Ms. James, you have 5 minutes, Ms. James.
Welcome to all of our guests. I'm going to direct most of my questions towards Mr. Winnick, but if there's someone else that wants to jump in, please feel free. Now, within your opening remarks, you had mentioned that the Canadian Forces and the Department of National Defence have a joint harassment prevention policy or resolution policy that applies to both military and civilian personnel. So I guess the first question is, this is a pretty broad spectrum, a pretty large group, so does a one-size policy actually fit all?
In general, in terms of human resource management generally, no. And that's why most policies are quite distinct. And in fact, most human resource policies as applied to military members derive from the National Defence Act and the Queen's regulations subordinate to them. Whereas on the civilian side, they come from the Treasury Board and the Public Service Employment Act and Public Service Staff Relations Act. So in most areas of HR policy, they don't. But there are areas where, particularly because we have mixed work teams, where it makes sense to have some commonality in approach in dealing with people who are working together, and where you have civilians reporting to military, military reporting civilians. And this is one area where we felt there was sufficient overlap we could have a joint policy. There are some minor differences in terms of application of the policy, but by and large it tends to work. And it ensures that you have the same kind of outcome for a process that applies equally to military and civilian people.
So if I understand correctly, the joint policy only covers the areas that are common to everyone?
Harassment.
Okay.
Yes.
In your statement, you've talked about the new version of the policy dated December 2002 shifted the emphasis to prevention early resolution through alternative dispute resolutions.
Correct.
And you've made a statement, it's actually near the end of your opening remarks, that through alternative dispute resolutions, statistics suggest a higher rate of harassment incidents, but that most complaints are actually being resolved through options of self-help, supervisor intervention, and mediation rather than the original or the, other methods. I'm just wondering, you've indicated that you find that to be encouraging. Now, the numbers seem to imply that statistics have gone up. Is it encouraging because we're able to resolve them early and prevent it from escalating? Or if you could just kind of explain what you mean by it's encouraging.
And there's two parts, I think, to my answer. First one is that the one of the key changes in the philosophy underlying the most recent version of the policy was to shift from a crime and punishment approach to harassment to a restorative justice approach. And that means that, except in the most egregious cases, what you want to do is restore some element of harmony to the workplace and preserve the sense of teamwork and cohesion that are essential to an effectively functioning defense team. So to keep resolution as low level as possible is the desired method. And given that, what our statistics from the 1998 survey show, that most sexual harassment incidents were of a verbal nature involving teasing, inappropriate remarks, that kind of thing, it makes sense to resolve that at a low level. Correct the behavior, tell people what they're doing wrong, tell them what they should be doing, make restitution, and then get back to work.
I'm glad you actually said that. You've said verbal teasing, making comments,
right.
so forth. Now, as politicians, many of us have very thick skin. We have to in order to get here in the first place. So a comment that is made to perhaps myself or one of my colleagues may not be offensive, may roll right off my back, doesn't bother me, doesn't stop me in my stride. How do you define, because in your definition of sexual harassment, I'm just trying to go back to your page, it's any improper conduct by an individual that is directed at and offensive to another person or persons in the workplace, and that the individual knew or ought to have known that it would cause offense or harm. How do you determine what is reasonable in that particular case? Because, again, something that may be, roll right off of my back may be like, oh my gosh, to another person or individual. So how do you define what's reasonable to determine whether it should be offensive or not offensive?
That's the million-dollar question, I think. I don't think you can do that a priori. I mean, we establish social norms of appropriate social norms of interaction through, as we go. It is through the process of social interaction that we determine what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. The important thing is that if you think it's inappropriate, is to say that it is inappropriate. And that was one of the other findings from our survey.
I'm so sorry. I will have to stop you here, Ms. James. Your time is up. I'm very sorry. Yes, 5 minutes goes by very quickly. So we'll now move to Ms. Asinia for 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Winnick, for your last response. Very interesting, and thank you to all of you for your very interesting presentations. The cultural changes of the last few years are greatly appreciated. You've really tackled the issue, and it shows. So my first question is for Mr. Winnick. Can you define sexual harassment as it is contained in your policy? Does it automatically involve rape and sexual harassment?
Harassment, Madam Chair, is not defined in our policy because it is included in the kinds of harassment covered by the Canadian Human Rights Act. And in that sense, our definition of harassment is actually broader than that in the Canadian Human Rights Act, because in the Canadian Human Rights Act, it refers to specifically the 11 prohibited grounds. So we don't define sexual harassment because I think common sense would dictate that people know what sexual harassment is. It's an element of harassment that is of the sexual nature. So that's fairly straightforward. So we don't define it for that reason, and because then we might be obliged to define, well, what's harassment based on national or ethnic origin? What's harassment based on sexual orientation? So we give a fairly broad definition that includes all those elements that are contained in the Canadian Human Rights Act. It does not include sexual assault. That is a separate area. That's covered under the sexual misconduct policy and is dealt with the appropriate military justice and police authorities.
Merci. Thank you very much. In your presentation a little earlier, you talked about unfounded complaints. Could you tell us what unfounded means? How is a complaint found to be unfounded? And do you have and why? Can you tell us more about the reasons why a complaint would not be founded? Tony, would you mind answering that?
Complaint is lodged. Similar to the new 5-step process that was introduced by Treasury Board, we've had that same 5-step process in place since our 2000 policy. The first step is to acknowledge the complaint. The second step then is to conduct a situational awareness to say, does it meet the grounds? And there's a series of grounds that are laid out to say, we will consider this to be a case of harassment and move it forward to investigation. So that's the first step where something might be found as unfounded. Doesn't meet the grounds to be treated as a harassment investigation case. And if it does move to investigation, it could be just simply an interpretation of, was it something that was unreasonable or not? And again, as we've just discussed, that's the million-dollar question. Was it reasonable or unreasonable? And it could just be simply a matter of interpretation or misinterpretation of what was said or meant, and therefore, again, could be determined to be unfounded. But again, that's going to be a case-by-case basis, so it's kind of hard to lump any sort of category of unfounded.
And that, if I may add, that's why it's important to have a third party sort of make the judgment. Because if you get into a dispute, he said, she said, or he said, she said, who's to decide? They each have, from their perspective, valid points of view. You need a third party to make that adjudication.
Thank you very much. That was a clear answer. Do you have any data regarding these unfounded complaints? And if so, can we know what those numbers are?
Would be in the annex. In the annex to the...
En fait, à l'annexe à mon mémoire, il y a des tableaux. Il y a 31 cas de harcèlement sexuel, 11 ont été fondés. Ça ne veut pas dire que les 20 autres sont non fondés, mais c'était peut-être le cas qu'elles étaient non fondées ou qu'on les a retirées ou qu'elles sont encore en cours de traitement. Alors, on n'a pas ici le chiffre exact des plaintes non fondées.
Question, je pense.
Final question. I think I have a little bit of time left. How long does it take to process a harassment complaint? I know some cases are still open, but what's the average time it takes to settle a complaint?
It's that our average for a founded complaint is about 90 days. The responsible officer has up to 180 days, and I think under new Treasury Board policy is up to 12 months. We do have cases that have been resolved in as little as 1 day and as much as 51 months. So it's all situational dependent, depending on availability of the parties and access to them for deployments, etc. So.
Je dois vous arrêter ici, Madame Assegna.
I'm sorry, we have to stop you here. Thank you, Ms. Assignan. Thank you for your response. Ms. Bittman, 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here.
For being here. The work that you're doing matters greatly to every one of the members on this committee, and we appreciate it, and we're very grateful to be able to learn from you. I personally, Mr. Winnick, and perhaps it's my training as a chartered accountant, but I appreciate the data that you have placed in here, because this is concrete, this is tangible, this is helpful. And if there was one thing missing, with no criticism to our previous testimony and our previous witnesses, they didn't have that precision. And it's very helpful because it gives us not only something concrete, but some context. So, je vous remercie pour ça.
So thank you very much for that.
Appreciate. I'm grateful that you don't survey your employees to death, because it wouldn't work. But it's just close enough. But you know, when you say about surveying people on their ethics and the efficacy of the various policies and the harassment, that's so useful. And clearly, I just want to confirm, sir, that this is done, these are blind surveys. They're not identified.
Oh, right. There are anonymous surveys. We have two kinds of survey procedures, Madam Chair, that we engage in. We have an internal defense research capability made up of a broad range of defense scientists, and they conduct either specialized focus surveys, which can be administered on an as-required basis or periodically. For example, a large-scale survey on harassment would be one of these kinds of surveys. But they also do continuous surveys where they sample from the population twice a year on a broad range of topics. You could call it a continuous opinion survey, if you like. And so we can track data longitudinally as well. And one of the reasons, by the way, why I included data is I'm a behavioral scientist by training, so we do policy on the basis of evidence and research and data, so I'm quite happy to provide that.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. Now, how do you work, just briefly on the data still, clearly the Government of Canada is investing significant resources in gathering data to these the public service surveys at vast cost, but very important, and they give some very important information, not only to senior managers, but to members of Parliament as well. How does that interface with your data collection process?
Well, we don't use the Public Service Employment Survey because our members are not public servants, and so there's a different set of
even
personnel.
Your civilians?
But that's a department. Okay. I speak for the Canadian Forces.
Of course. Right. So, but is it a useful tool to compare data?
Oh, absolutely. We do comparisons. Well, I cited Statistics Canada data earlier in terms of the employment of women. So we do comparisons with the national databases. We do comparisons with other government departments. We do comparisons with other militaries. And we're part of an organization called the Technical Cooperation Program, which exists among Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, sometimes referred to as Five Eyes. And we have an ongoing information technology exchange program with them. So we routinely do surveys, sometimes the same survey administered to 5 military or the militaries of 5 different nations as a basis of comparison. It's a way of benchmarking what we do.
Yes, and I'm very grateful to hear that there's that sharing because, you know, why reinvent the wheel if somebody has the...
We steal from each other.
Absolutely, with gratitude, with gratitude. Now, you spoke at length on quelques minutes, une autre?
40 seconds already.
So if you could just, like one of the stats I heard from you was that 90% of your personnel are exposed to harassment training of some sort. Does that permeate every rank, every level, and how do you do that?
Well, yes. This was in the survey that 90% of the respondents recalled having been through some form of harassment training. Now, to sort of set the stage for that answer and explain why that might have been the case was that during the late 90s, and I can't remember when we discontinued the SHARP program, but we had a blitz across the Canadian Forces which required everybody who was serving at the time to take part in this 1-day, 1.5-day training program on standards for harassment and racism prevention.
Devoir vous arrêter ici, malheureusement.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you off here. I'm very sorry. However, the document you referred to seems very interesting, so perhaps committee members might be interested in reading it if possible. Perhaps you can send it to us. That's great. Thank you. If you could just send the information to the clerk, our clerk will follow up with you. So now, Ms. Day, 5 minutes. Thank you very much. From the outset, I would like to thank you for being here. This committee always seeks new information, and so we're asking you questions, and we appreciate your giving us information. So I have some fairly specific questions. I looked at all the figures you presented us with, and the Ombudsman said that there were 375 out of 16,000 complaints from harassment complaints since the office existed, and then other numbers were presented by Mr. Wanek. And in terms of the military personnel, in 10 years, 513 complaints, so 6%. So when I saw these numbers, I reacted quite strongly because these numbers are very eloquent. And Mr. Gauthier said that our investigators always try to resolve complaints at the lowest possible level, and that might be within union, as opposed to within the union or with the supervisor or the military police. And this is not an attack on you, but I think that amongst the general public, people feel that there still is sexual harassment and harassment within the armed forces. So I'm just wondering whether you quickly settled some cases before coming here. I'm not asking for specific numbers, but I'm just wondering whether 80% of cases have been quickly settled, or most complaints which you received. Do you have anything to say in that regard?
Madam Chair, if I understand the question properly, I wouldn't say that we don't have any cases of sexual harassment or sexual assault. I think every organization is going to have to deal with that, a large organization like ours. I would hope that we would get to zero one day, but I don't think that's realistic. I mean, you have new people coming into the organization. They bring their norms, their ways of acting and so on, and when something is wrong, we try and correct it. But there's been no special effort to sort of clean up our data. We collected it as it was, and we've presented it today as it has existed over the past several years. Anything you want to add?
No, same comment for the civilian side. We did not do any immediate actions to speed up closing of any files. We pulled the data as it existed.
The only thing I would add is that if you think the statistics are artificially low, for example,
Je suis vraiment désolée.
Again, I'm very sorry to have to interrupt. It seems that there's a vote in the House, so I will have to end this meeting. Otherwise, we will not have enough time. And unfortunately, we will not have time to come back afterwards. Perhaps members of the committee could re-invite you for an hour, because I think that what you have to say is important for the committee, and I think we still have questions for you. So we will get back in touch with you. And again, I am very, very sorry that this is happening, and thank you so much for coming here. So I will have to end this meeting right now. Thank you.